On behalf of the Alumni Board and the Cat Talks Committee, thank you guys all for being here for this third annual Cat Talks event. Cat Talks is an evolution of our former Back to School Night event, and it allows all of us an opportunity in the Westminster alumni community to hear from some of our esteemed alums, and thanks to the video technology, it's alumni near and far that can enjoy this presentation. And tonight we are very honored to have Jarrett Blanc from the class of 1993 and Laurie Dew from the class of 1986 here to speak with us. We're going to begin tonight with Jarrett. Jarrett is currently a senior fellow in the Geoeconomic and Strategy program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was previously the State Department coordinator for the Iran nuclear implementation under President Obama, responsible for the full and effective implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Prior to this position, he was the Principal Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He played a key role in mediating the Afghan electoral process, leading efforts to spark Afghan-led peace processes, securing the negotiated release of Sergeant Bergdahl, and unwinding more than a decade of U.S. detention operations in Afghanistan. During his government service, Jarrett has twice received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award and received the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, which is its highest civilian honor. Before joining the State Department in 2009, Jarrett spent many years working for international organizations and NGOs, advising senior decision makers on conflict termination and political transition. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard University and his master's degree in environmental science and policy from Johns Hopkins University. So welcome, Jarrett.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for everybody who organized this evening. I had the pleasure of spending the day with some of the students, current students at Westminster, who were just remarkably impressive. So if there are any parents in the room, well done. If any of them come back and say that I suggested that they should start their careers in war zones, I'm sure they misheard. I was the class of 1993. It's only in the last couple of years that I've stopped having nightmares about being let out of a car in front of Scott Hall, naked and needing to take all of the exams of a 7-year period, and I'm expecting that those will probably start again now, just in time for our 25th reunion. So other than that, this has been kind of a perfect day. As has been kind of briefly described, after graduating from here, I made a series of manifestly terrible life decisions that led me to a career in negotiating with our national security adversaries. And so, having... Can you move up to the mic? Sure. Having spent a few years trying to negotiate with the Taliban, I begged Secretary Kerry to let me do something else. And he said, well, how about Iran? And this was the... I was one of probably a relatively modest handful of people for whom this would seem to be a break. And so I leapt at it and was suggested that it might be interesting to talk about today. So what I'm going to do, and I'll try to do in about 15 minutes so that we've got time to talk, is to just go over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, or what's generally referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. And I'll try to cover kind of 4 issues. I'll give a brief description of what the deal is. I'll talk about how that translated into the job of implementing it, so what we were doing kind of day to day in the last couple of years of the Obama administration. I will tell one longish story about a funny thing that happened. And then I'll very briefly point to what I think might be going on in the news today. So starting with what the deal is. I have described it, and a few people in this room have heard me describe it as the most complicated, simple deal I've ever worked on. So the simple part is this, that we in the United States were very concerned that Iran might have a covert nuclear program. And we imposed some really devastating economic sanctions on Iran in order to persuade them that they should not have a covert nuclear program. We were able to convince a very, very wide array of allies and partners, really non-traditional partners like India, China, Russia, that this would be a serious problem for the world, not only if Iran actually had a nuclear weapon, but if they were existing in a kind of gray, ambiguous state where nobody knew for sure. And we therefore convinced them to follow along and to impose with us a variety of really serious economic harms on Iran. So that's where we started. And Iran eventually came around to saying, okay, well, we will give you confidence that we do not have this covert nuclear program if you lift all of those really devastating sanctions. And so that was the simple deal. We put the sanctions in place. They gave us some confidence that they weren't doing what we were worried about, and then we lifted the sanctions. The complicated part is that it's 150 pages long. And there are reasons for that. One of the reasons I would give is that there was a little bit of a model for this experience in the 1990s when we were negotiating a similar set of problems with North Korea. And the final documents that came out of those negotiations were about 2.5 pages long. And they fell apart. And if you ask people, why did they fall apart? You might hear, well, North Korea cheated. It's a little bit more complicated than that. North Korea did something that we didn't anticipate. Whether or not it was actually a violation of the deal is hard to say because the deal didn't have maybe enough specificity to it. What we learned, though, in implementing this much more complicated and detailed Iran deal is that a thicket of words can be as difficult to understand sometimes as a paucity of words. I guess there are lawyers in the room, so this is probably not tremendous news to any of you. But so we ended up detailing in a lot of specificity exactly what Iran was going to be allowed to do within the space of their civil nuclear program. And they gave up a lot of the elements of the program that they had developed, which would have allowed them to eventually produce enough fissile material for an atomic explosive device, and to learn the very difficult engineering lessons that you would need to learn in order to turn that fissile material into an explosive device. And so they basically gave up the elements of their program that could eventually lead in that direction. And we specified that in a lot of detail. And then at the same time, they allowed a very, very invasive international inspection regime to monitor what they were doing so that in addition to all the intelligence information that we have on them, we would have this kind of public source information through a UN body called the International Atomic Energy Agency that would be able to say, we know exactly where every speck of enriched uranium in Iran is. We know exactly where every centrifuge is. We know exactly where this old piece of equipment called a calandria that you've required them to pull out of the ground and destroy is. And by maintaining that level of insight, we would be able to sort of be certain for ourselves that Iran was sticking to these limitations that they had agreed to, and therefore was within the four corners of the deal. We agreed to a similarly detailed set of specifications as to what it would mean to lift the sanctions. So, got about 35 pages of details on nuclear stuff, and about 35 pages of details on these sanctions that go through exactly what we in Washington, what regulators in Brussels, what people in New York would do to relieve the sanctions that had been targeting Iran to this point. Now, when I came into this job, so kind of summer of 2015, my expectation, my guess would have been that I was going to spend most of my time, probably almost all of my time, making sure that Iran was living up to their part of the deal, right? That they were fully implementing their obligations, and we were certainly extremely strict on that question. But what I didn't necessarily anticipate coming into the job was that it was going to be at least equally difficult to make sure that we lived up to our side of the deal, right? All of those very specific commitments that we had made vis-a-vis sanctions relief. Not because there was any lack of goodwill on the part of the United States. I mean, the day that we came into compliance with the deal, we issued all of the necessary regulatory amendments to come into sort of formal compliance. But it turns out that it's hard for people in the private sector, and I know there are at least a couple of bankers in the room. Is there anyone here from SunTrust? Long story. It's difficult for the private sector to hear sanctions liberalization as opposed to sanctions imposition. It's much easier if you're a banker to say, okay, I get it. The United States is going to have a problem with me if I do business with X. If we turn around 5 or 10 years later and say, you know what, actually go ahead and do business with X, incorporating that into your business decisions, we in the government didn't have a very clear picture as to how that would go. And so a fair amount of effort had to be expended on our side in making sure that the private sector, other partner governments, had a pretty clear and comprehensive understanding of what U.S. sanctions policy was post the JCPOA. So we ended up in this kind of weird, it almost as if we had two jobs. On the one hand, chasing down sort of every last question or doubt about Iran's nuclear program. By the way, I hadn't taken physics since high school. And the Secretary of Energy, who was a key negotiator of this, was the chairman of MIT's physics department, Dr. Ernie Moniz. And so I would have to go to his conference room and give these briefings about Iran's nuclear program. This is ridiculous. And so at one point, one of the guys who was working with me, there are unsung heroes in the United States civil service, or there were before we started firing them. One of these unsung heroes who retired is a guy named Jim Timby, who is a PhD from Stanford, actually, nuclear physics, incredibly brilliant guy, negotiated every single important arms control agreement that the United States has ever had. And so I said to him early on, I said, Jim, how do I get the basics here? And so he gave me a copy of a book called the Los Alamos Primer, which is, so when scientists were going to Los Alamos, right, they had no idea what they were going there for. And so somebody realized we're spending a lot of time explaining the task. And so one of the scientists wrote this little sort of 45-page booklet that said, this is what we're trying to do, and these are the scientific and engineering problems we're trying to solve. And it turns out that if you want to build an atomic explosive device, you kind of have to solve the same problems again now. And so if you want to make sure that another country is not building an atomic explosive device, going back to the Los Alamos Primer and asking, are they trying to do this, or are they trying to do that, is kind of not a bad way to start. It's really hard. And then at the same time, as we're doing that job, we're also trying to kind of figure out how does the private sector perceive this decision-making process, and how can we make sure that Iran is actually receiving at least the de minimis benefits that are sort of envisioned in the deal so that they stick with it. And from that came my conclusion that the international financial system is a sewer, and all the pipes run to New York. And so if you ever have a question about what you're allowed or not allowed to do, you have to ask New York, because the pipes all go there. So that's what the deal is, what the job looked like a little bit on a day-to-day basis. And now I want to tell my funny story. There's a camera on, but I'll do it anyway. So the deal had a very complex phased implementation period. So it was concluded in July of 2015. It reached something called Adoption Day in September of 2015. And then it went through these different moments until basically it was all driven by Iran. Iran had to meet all of the obligations under the deal. And once they did that, we would meet our obligations. And so they did that pretty quickly, and they reached implementation day in January of 2016. The reason for them wanting to do it quickly is obvious, right? Because they're not getting any advantage until they're completely done with their commitments. So this didn't align perfectly with my private life, because our second child was due in January of 2016, and actually ended up being born on Christmas Day of 2015. Now, nobody is irreplaceable. We had a fantastic team. In almost any circumstance, I just would have stepped away and gone to the hospital and let the team do the job. But there was this one really complicated element of the implementation that was all in my head. And it ended up it turned into a monster. It was, the Iranians had to ship out this quantity of low enriched uranium, 20% enriched uranium, and receive natural uranium in return. And there were 7 countries involved in the transaction. And it wasn't written down anywhere. It was just in my head, and the baby was early, and it was all coming to a head as we're having this baby in Sibley Hospital. And so I later figured out that I had sent and received something like 2,000 emails from the hospital, and I apologized to my wife, who said, "Oh, sweetheart, you might not have known you were going to do this, but I did." So at one point, I've got the baby in my arm, and I've got my BlackBerry in hand. And the nurse comes in, and I can see in her eyes that she's heard me say 3 and only 3 words. She's heard me say Iran, Kazakhstan, and uranium. And I thought, oh, God, the FBI is going to be here. They didn't, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But So there's my little funny story. And then the last thing, where do we stand right now? So first of all, where we stand is that there's a pretty broad consensus in Washington that the United States should stay in this deal. A lot of people, a lot of Republicans in the House and Senate who were virulently opposed to the deal when President Obama concluded it, are also opposed to President Trump drawing out of it. You can draw your conclusions about what the opposition comes from. The one person in Washington who seems not convinced by this is President Trump. And so despite the fact that General Mattis, General McMaster, Secretary Tillerson have all laid out in pretty stark terms the dangers associated with withdrawing from the deal. Let's go back for a second to how we got here, right? That the United States didn't do this alone. We persuaded a very broad group of non-traditional partners that there was a real problem, that we had a way to solve it, and that all we needed from them was some serious economic harm to their countries in order to get there. And they were willing to do that, right? Now try to run this without those partners, right? And where the problem doesn't look to be Iran, but looks to be us. So that's all been laid out for President Trump. How he's going to decide it in the end, I've decided to stop trying to predict. But what I know about this is that there's a broad universe of people who are all trying to come up with some kind of politically viable solution whereby President Trump can have his win and we can avoid the really severe national security consequences of pulling out of the deal while Iran is in compliance. So with that, I think we got about 15 minutes left. And let me just throw it open. I think, can we exchange opening volleys?
Sure. I think my question is, under any circumstances, could Tehran actually be trusted? And does it matter who's leading Iran? I think, was it Hassan Rouhani who's leading Iran? And of course the Ayatollah is above him, right?
Right.
Under any circumstances, could they be trusted? Do we know who's next if they're pushed out?
Well, let me.
Or I got it all wrong.
No, you don't have, but let me start with the broad question. Can Iran be trusted? And the answer to this is that my general sort of point of view as a diplomat, as a negotiator, is not to trust anybody. And I certainly didn't trust Iran, right? That's why this deal was designed in order to get away from the question of trust, right? And in particular, the deal required Iran to do all of the things that were necessary of it, right? To reduce its stocks of low-enriched uranium, to reduce its available stockpile of functioning centrifuges, to disable the Iraq plutonium reactor. They had to do all of this before they got any sanctions relief. So the idea here was not to trust, but rather to sequence in a way that gave us comfort that our fundamental national security objectives were being met. Does it matter who governs Iran? I mean, to this deal, maybe not, actually. And in fact, President Rouhani was just reelected last year. He faced, I think, 4 competitors, 3 of whom came from kind of the, let's call it the right of Iranian politics. It doesn't work exactly, but and actually none of them ran against the deal. They said, I could have negotiated a better deal, which is, by the way, one of my favorite criticisms. One of them said, I can get more out of this now that we have the deal in place, right? But none of them said, let's walk away from the deal. So does it matter who's in charge of Iran? Maybe not, actually. What matters probably is Iran getting something out of this? Because if they are, it is enough of a democratic polity that it's hard to sort of pull out. Does it matter to us more broadly who's in charge of Iran? The answer to that is sure, but it is my strong view that we overestimate our cleverness in dabbling in other countries' internal politics. And so the idea that, does it matter? Sure. Do we have a way to intelligently influence it that is controlled and that might not, and it isn't just as likely to resound to our detriment as our benefit? I don't think so.
Thanks.
You mentioned something about not having anticipated something to do with North Korea, and that led from a 2.5-page to a 90-page document, or whatever it was. What was it that we did not anticipate with North Korea?
Well, broadly speaking, there are 2 ways to get fissile material for an atomic explosive device. You can enrich uranium, or you can produce plutonium. And at the time that the deal was negotiated with North Korea, they seemed to be on one path, and the deal was therefore focused on that path, and it didn't adequately cover the potentialities of the other path. The JCPOA, the Iran deal, entirely covers both the uranium and the plutonium pathways. So Iran was farther along in the uranium pathway. They had a domestic enrichment program that had never produced enough material or enriched to the level necessary for weaponization, but could. And they basically agreed to reduce dramatically their available centrifuges, so what they were able to enrich at any time, to reduce by 99.9% the amount of low enriched uranium in country, and to reduce the level of low enriched uranium that they would have from, at the time they had about 20, enriched up to about 20%, and now they can have it only up to 3 point something. And then at the same time, Iran was developing this reactor that could conceivably have developed plutonium, which eventually you could have reprocessed for use in weaponization. And what they agreed to do was to remove the guts of this reactor, something called the calandria, I don't know what that word means, and to destroy it, and to accept to redesign the reactor using a design that would be assisted by the United States and China, actually, and that can't practically be used to produce weaponizable plutonium.
Yeah. I have a question on the generic issue with sanctions, that if you impose sanctions for a specific objective, then you get it, and then you don't keep to the deal. What does that mean for all the other countries you might impose sanctions on, and how they'll accept those kinds of sanctions, and how your partners will accept sanctions?
Have you been reading my webpage? No, look, so you can think about the United States has a tremendous amount of power as a result of our position as the center of the financial sewer, right? And we are tempted to overuse that power. So you can think of sanctions in a few different ways, right? You can think of sanctions as don't just stand there, do something, right? We're not going to go to war with these guys, let's sanction them. You can think of a sanction as basically an expression of, moral outrage. These guys have done something that is wrong, and we should sanction them as a result. I like to think of sanctions as a pretty effective leverage tool in order to create the conditions for a successful negotiation, right? I don't really care about castigating the enemy. I want to achieve my national security objective. And in order to do that, I think you've got to have two things. First of all, you've got to prove that you can effectively harm the target country, and we have demonstrated that. At least we've demonstrated it when we do these things in conjunction with allies and partners. And the second is you have to prove that you can relieve the sanctions as a result of a negotiated outcome, right? Otherwise, what's the point of the negotiation? One of the topics that I work on at this think tank actually is this question of, in my perception, and broadly speaking, I think in most people's perceptions, the countries that have gone through this experience over the last couple of decades, Iran, Cuba, Burma, Libya, have gotten less out of sanctions relief than would have been anticipated by experts. And I don't know how many times you can go to that well without fixing the problem and still expect to be able to use this as an actual tool for negotiation as opposed to just an expression of outrage.
Jared, how long do you think it would take for us to rebuild our international diplomatic capacity if we started today? Or if we started tomorrow?
So, Mark is assuming the predicate, which is that a year plus of this administration has diminished our technical capacity to do diplomacy, and unfortunately, there's a lot of truth there. A lot of you have probably read this, right? But when I left the State Department on Inauguration Day, there were, I think, 5 or 6 of the equivalent of 4-star generals of the United States Foreign Service. So these are career civil servants. All of them had served more years under Republican presidents than Democratic presidents, right? There are now 2 left. One has announced his resignation. The other, a close friend of mine, has not been given a real job. So you go down the ranks to the 3 stars, the 2 stars, and so on down, and it is replicated over and over again. the best young officers who worked with me on any of these crises. I mean, at this point, I'll just say of the two very best, one has left the department and one is getting its CV ready. So that's devastating. It is unheard of in U.S. presidential transitions that you would have an experience like this. So how do you rebuild it? I don't know, because it's never really happened before. But what I would say is that the esprit de corps, the dedication to mission of this career civil service, the Foreign Service, which I was not part of, right? I was a political officer. But their esprit de corps is so intense that I think that tomorrow, if the Secretary of State were to sort of issue a real clarion call, we want you back, and this is what we are going to ask you to do, I think they would start coming back. The danger is, what happens 3 years from now or whenever, and are those people still in a position to sort of resume their posts?
What did we learn about how the Iranian government makes decisions in a serious negotiation like yours?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say about the Iranian government is that they are a well-functioning professional government, right? So, dealing with Iranian diplomats is a relatively straightforward experience. Other entities I've dealt with, they don't have the kind of the bureaucratic either experience or machinery to keep track of what goes on from meeting to meeting, right? So you might have to start over again a lot. That doesn't really happen with the Iranians. You get to a point at the end of the meeting, and when you pick up the next day, maybe they've gotten some countervailing instruction, but they'll explain that to you. It's a fairly straightforward, modern diplomatic experience. Now, diplomats don't make decisions. I was never a decision maker, right? I was just a representative. And when you go above that professional layer to sort of who's deciding what in Iran, it does become really opaque, because you've got, on the one hand, a reasonably democratic elected government, which is pretty responsive to the will of the people, but is also tightly constrained in the areas of policy that it fully controls. And then you've got this clerical hierarchy, which is able to kind of Bigfoot the democratic government, at least on some issues, more or less at will. And so identifying who is making a decision on what issue is complicated. And to some extent, I think as an outside negotiator, you have to decide, you know what, I don't care, right? You can come to me and say, the Supreme Leader has told us that everyone's got their decision-making process, right? You state your instructions, I'll state mine, and then we'll figure out if there's a way forward.
The European, more level-headed European governments are involved in the development of a secondary treaty in addition to our treaty, the present treaty, to stop the development of the ICBMs, as you know. That's going on?
So President Trump has gone to 3 of our European partners, the UK, the French, and the Germans.
Trump mobilized this idea?
I wouldn't exactly say that. So he...
Hook? Brian Hook?
Yeah.
Him?
So President Trump has gone to these countries and he said, there's certain elements of this deal that I'm not satisfied with, right? I'm not satisfied that it didn't cover ICBMs. I'm not satisfied about the strength of the inspection regime, and I'm not satisfied by something called the sunset clauses. So this is, over time, some of these restrictions on Iran phase out, starting about 8 years from now. And I'm going to pull out of the deal today unless you promise to work with me to address these concerns of mine. On the ICBM stuff, it's actually pretty straightforward because we all sort of agree on this. Iran's not developing an ICBM. If they were, it would be a point of very deep concern. And like the potential for a nuclear weapons program, we would be in a position to build an international coalition to address it. So that's kind of there's a way forward there. And it's nothing new. There's nothing being motivated there. It's just a different way of talking about it, and probably not as effective a way. It's a little bit similar on the inspections. The idea that there's a problem with the inspections regime is at this point very theoretical. Nobody can actually point to something that for example, the intelligence community has wanted done that hasn't been done. So again, there's kind of a way forward. It's on these sunsets that things get a little bit complicated, because there is a point of agreement here. There's always been a point of agreement, which is that the JCPOA is in many respects like an arms control agreement. It's not exactly an arms control agreement, but it's like one. And every arms control agreement in history has envisioned its own follow-on. They are never in perpetuity agreements. They're always agreements that point to something in the future. And the JCPOA points to some kind of successor agreement. So if you go to the Europeans and you say, I want acknowledgement that there should be something following the JCPOA, the answer is, yeah, of course. I mean, didn't you read the START Treaty? If you go to them and you say, I want your commitment today that follow-on should include A, B, and C, and if it doesn't, here are the threats you're going to make, they're never going to get there. And they shouldn't. It's bad diplomacy.
Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. My question is, did you always have a knack for negotiating, or was it something you honed over your schooling and career? And the second part of the question is, are you effective at negotiating with your toddlers?
Neither my children nor my wife. I will say, though, that my older son said to our neighbors the other day that I was the strictest father in the second grade, which is a lie, but I like it. I don't know. I don't think it's a knack exactly. What I will say is that, and I give a tremendous amount of credit to Westminster for this, is that the skill set is really nothing more than reading and writing, right? I mean, it's being able to quickly get to the point of a written document, to find its flaws, to see the heart of it, and then to be able to quickly write an answer. As an old boss of mine used to like to say, just give me a paragraph on this, or if you don't have time, make it a page, right? And that's, I really think, I mean, most of what the U.S. government, most of what you do as a U.S. government negotiator is really just figuring out what the U.S. government position needs to be, and that it all sort of just comes down to that. And honestly, more than anything else in my either education or professional life, I got that here. Thank you all. Oh, sorry. That was. We have 5 minutes. The thank you was to Westminster for the skill set.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the premise of there were trade-offs to get this deal done, clearly. And were there any reservations? I mean, like, because the sunset is the issue that concerns, I think, the people. It's like there were a lot of trade-offs with relationships between the Sunni and Shia, between Israel and those other factors. So I guess what I want to hear is, like, were they worth it? Do you feel like, are you worried about the sunset? What is going to happen in 8 years?
Well, I think there are a few different questions kind of contained in there. There's a question of trade-offs. There's a question of sort of consequences outside the deal, and then there's a question of things that the deal didn't address, right? So the deal didn't address ballistic missiles. It didn't address support for regional proxies. If the standard for any negotiated settlement is it's got to cover every issue, then there's no negotiated settlement to anything. So we picked the most important thing for U.S. national security, which is the question of a potential Iranian nuclear weapon, and we addressed that issue. And did we get everything else? No, but addressing that one means that you're in a much stronger position to talk about the other stuff, right? Because you don't have this sort of Damocles over your head. I think there's always room to do better on alliance management, right? So could we have done better with the Sunni states, with the Israelis? Absolutely. Our domestic politics here didn't help, quite frankly. There was an unheard of level of amateurism from certain elements that invited kind of an intensity of response from some of those allies that are partners that is unusual, and I hope people have learned a lesson from. On the sunsets, what I would say is, of course I'm worried about the sunsets. I would be much more worried if Iran was a month away from enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon today than I am about the potential that they could be at that point in 14 years, which is kind of 12 years from today. So 12 years is, in diplomacy, 12 years is a lot of time to try to deal with the next problem, right? So I'm worried about them, but I'm not so worried about them as to call into question the value of the deal. So there's my apologia for.
I guess the question is, how do you get them back to the table in a year?
Oh, well, so there are a couple things. There are a couple answers to that question. One is that there is always an inherent stick, right? I do not believe that Iran believes that they could, in 10 years, sort of restart a full-fledged nuclear program and not face an international problem. And these are deals, they're trades. There are things that we can offer Iran in X number of years that they will want. And so I don't actually think that getting to the table on this issue, some issues it's hard to get to the table. On this issue, I actually don't think that that's really the problem. Now, the follow-on deal is going to be really hard. We could talk about that, but there's a lot would be groundbreaking in it. But I don't actually think that starting the negotiation is the killer.
I recall a few years ago, The Economist put out a special report on Iran and missile development, and that they believe that they have the capability to reach Israel and Saudi Arabia, which makes them nervous neighbors out there. I imagine that this deal did not address that at all, but where do you see their capabilities at right now?
So what I would say about Iran and ballistic missiles is that there are three, you want to distinguish three different issues. One is the potential for ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this is something that Iran has not really been working on. If they were to be working on them, I would have very deep concerns about it because it would be hard to understand that doctrinally other than as a delivery device for nuclear weapons. So that would be a problem. The second question is proliferation. So Iran, unfortunately, does, I believe, share missile technology with some of its non-state proxy actors. That is insane. And there is, I believe, space, probably more for the Europeans now than for us, to try to see whether that can be reined in to any degree. And then the last piece of it is their, let's call it domestic ballistic missile program, right? So ballistic missiles with a range of, somewhere short of 2,000 kilometers, which can hit Israel and can hit Saudi Arabia. But it is not that hard to understand why Iran is looking for these weapons, right? That if you go back to the formative experience, I believe, the formative experience for the current generation of Iranian leadership was not the revolution, it was the Iran-Iraq War, where they were almost entirely isolated. Iraq was receiving substantial support from its Arab neighbors and from us. And Iranian civilians were under constant bombardment at different times. And Iran decides at that point, we need sort of an over-the-horizon standoff artillery capacity. We can't build an air force because the U.S. controls so many of these parts that we're not going to be able to build and maintain an air force. But we can build ballistic missiles because the technology there is not so complicated. And so this is one of those things where I don't love the fact that a bunch of countries have ballistic missiles. I don't love the fact that Iran has them. But I think it's just a reality of the world we live in. And it's a reality which we can probably manage using other tools so long as we don't let ourselves get distracted by sort of, extraneous squirrels. I think that was the last question. This time, thank you all very much. It's been a lot of fun.